Welcome to the Toldinstone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Professor Michael Carter. Dr. Carter, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Dr. Carter is professor of Greek and Roman history and Latin at Brock University, and he has written a long series of articles on the fascinating lives of the gladiators, everything from their lives to their status to the rules of combat. And so I wanted to take a deep dive into the world of the gladiators, how they lived and how they fought, with a focus on the early imperial era. So to get started, just with the beginning, how did men become gladiators?
That's an excellent question. Of course, there's a long history of the institution all the way back to the mid-Republic and then into the Christian Empire. So initially, of course, they were prisoners of war, slaves who were sold or captured and then made to fight, often in funerals at the tombs of great Romans. But by the imperial period is when the institution is sort of cemented and become institutionalized. And at this point, most of the gladiators seem to be, of course, slaves. But there's a large number of volunteers, free men who volunteer to fight in the arena to join a gladiatorial school. And also, of course, ex-gladiators, almost free agents who return to the institution. So there's a mix. Technically, I think they're all slaves. They swear an oath. They sort of sell themselves to the gladiatorial school, to the owner of the school. But the origins of them are, both servile and free, which is kind of a shocking thing when you first realize that you've got free people volunteering to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, it is astonishing. And that infamous oath, to be burned by fire, or the blade and all of that.
It's pretty beaten, burned, and killed by the sword.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty dire.
Yeah, it's a very dire sort of thing to hold your hand up and agree to do. But I think there were obviously reasons for people doing this.
So the schools, the ludi, how are they organized? How much do we know about this?
Actually, we know a fair bit about how they're organized, both from literary references, from inscriptions, epigraphy, and also from archaeological evidence that's sort of emerging from all over the empire. You've probably seen some of the different reports. They're owned by, they could be owned by the emperor. So we know he owned a large number of schools. There are schools just outside, archaeologically, there are schools just outside the Colosseum that we can study. They would be run by a manager, often referred to as a lanista. And they seem to be very complex. The more we learn about them, the more complex the picture emerges of what the school involves. Of course, gladiators. There would be also physicians. Galen, famously, the famous Dr. Galen worked as a physician to a gladiatorial school in Pergamon. There were instructors. They called them, so it's confusing. They call the instructors are a doctor or a magister. And the doctores, the teachers, well, they seem to be actually organized by gladiatorial type. So there are retiari, sort of net men in the arena. There are myrmilones, these more heavily armed gladiators, secutors, these more heavily armed gladiators. And epigraphically, the evidence seems to show that the instructors for gladiators aren't just a universal instructor, but they're organized by type. So there's a specialist instructor for the retiari. There are specialist instructors for the secutors, for the myrmilos, and on we go. In addition to this, probably other slaves or other people working in the ludus. We know about masseurs, people that give them massages. They're athletes of a sort.
Right.
People to work on their armor, so armament. People, probably guards. So it's a much more complex kind of. Even though the group is called a familia, which is a term for slaves, of course, it's a much more complex kind of institution. And then I think, actually, probably the more senior gladiators, they have a stake in surviving. They have a stake in the ludus, the school, not being out of control. And so they're probably the ones who are partly, I think, maintaining order in the school. And then on top of this, as I think about it, not only gladiators and people associated with that, but there's also evidence for damnati, or people who have been condemned to death, being part of a school or being held in a school, so that when a show comes up, you've got gladiators to fight, you've got probably referees you can offer, other people to help oversee the production of the show, but then also convicts who are in the school are then about to appear in the arena to be executed, and they're part of the school as well.
Interesting. I had no idea. So it's a full service operation, sounds like. But
yeah, and I think it's part of how it all was put together. If you wanted to put on a gladiatorial show, if you're a priest or something, you need to put on a show. You approach, or you have one of your agents approach a lanista and deal with all the financing that way. But he would provide everything you need, I think.
Huh. Well, that's fascinating. Now you mentioned the types of gladiators, the retiari, the secutors, the mirmillones. Do we have a sense of what the most popular types were and whether there was kind of change over time and the most popular varieties?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Of course, in the Republic, it's slightly different. So before Augustus, before Julius Caesar, the main types seem to have been the Galli, the Gauls, Thracians, and Samnites. So ethnic kind of groups. But after Augustus, we have more specialized types, and you mentioned the retiari. So a retiarius is a lightweight, very agile, very quick kind of gladiator, a net man who had a trident and a net, and he was very quick. He could run around. And he was typically matched up against a secutor, which in Latin means a chaser or a pursuer, a much more heavily armed, a heavy helmet with small eye sockets, big heavy shield, greaves on his legs, wrapping on his sword arm, and he's much slower. He would kind of methodically plod around after the retiarius. So that's a very common matchup. We see it depicted on mosaics and reliefs, that sort of thing. The mirmillo is another heavily armored type of gladiator. And there's a number of them, but the most common, I think, you'd say the mirmillo as a heavily armed gladiator, the secutor as a heavily armed gladiator, and the retiarius as a lightly armed gladiator. And then I think for me, almost the most remarkable thing is that these types are pretty much found across the empire. So whether you're in Britain or if you're on the Euphrates, if you're in Germany or you're in North Africa, you would see recognizable types of gladiators. They're not, regional types necessarily.
And there's often, so as in like the secutor retiarius matchup, there's attempt to match a light and a heavy, right? You have that kind of dynamic in combat.
Yeah, that appeal to the Romans in the sense that there's strengths and weaknesses for each of them. So the retiarius is well protected, but he can't see very well, and he's fighting in the hot sun. It would be a slower, a slower type of attack, and the retiarius is quick and agile, and so that appealed to the Romans, I think. A fair fight, but with different strengths and weaknesses.
Now, do we have a sense of how often the average gladiator fought in the arena?
That's a difficult one. The one way to get at it is to study tombstones or the epitaphs of gladiators. If you put together hundreds of them, which we know these exist, you end up with kind of a number. They seem to fight 20-ish times. If we get their life expectancy, they die in 30. But it's kind of typical for the times anyway. So it's a really difficult thing to say, how long they lived. If we start from the assumption that it's a form of kind of a spectacle of homicide, that gladiators are in there to kill each other, it would be remarkable if they lived out as long as the evidence suggests that they do. But in fact, I think the evidence, which we'll probably talk about in a bit, suggests that, in fact, there are rules and regulations and other forms of governance of the spectacle that mean that gladiators don't always fight to the death or anything.
Okay. One of the many myths, right, that surrounds the men of the arena. So during the early imperial era, I know the games they're at their most spectacular. We can hear about Trajan's games and the Trajan Wars, for example, with their thousands of gladiators. And even on a provincial scale, these, what seemed to us almost ludicrously extravagant spectacles.
Right.
So who is sponsoring these very expensive games in which gladiators are appearing?
Yeah. So again, there's an evolution, and in the
Hmm.
Republic, they tended to be funerary games. So the relatives of
Hmm.
a great man would part of the funeral was to put on they called it a munus, so an obligation or presentation to the people. And then under Augustus is when that all changes, and it really becomes especially linked to the celebration of the imperial cult. Now, not necessarily only, but for example, in the Greek world, where we have lots of evidence, almost all of the games, and there's lots of games, but they're
Hmm.
all in connection with the imperial cult or the celebration of the emperor as a god. So every year there was an annual imperial cult festival, and part of the celebration of the festival was to put on wild beast hunts and gladiators, so a traditional munus. So that's in the provinces. In Rome, of course, magistrates, of course, as they always put on games in the past, and then of course the emperors as well. And of course, the evidence always talks about the great, fantastic games,
Right, right.
and those are the games of the emperors that we hear most about in our literary sources.
Hmm.
Epigraphically and other forms of evidence from the provinces show a slightly different picture.
Oh, sure.
Mhm.
Do we have a sense of how much such games would have cost, and more specifically, how much it cost to rent a gladiator, say, for the day?
I mean, that's the fascinating thing is that
Hmm.
um, expensive. There is a document from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, late in his reign, probably dates to 176, 177. Um, we can date it because it's Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus is his co-emperor, and that's a very tight window.
Hmm.
And it's a remarkable document. It's an inscription that survives from Spain, um, but it's actually a version of a law that was passed by the Roman Senate under Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, which was meant to reduce the cost of gladiatorial. It seems that inflation was getting out of control and
Hmm.
the costs were skyrocketing. And so this is an attempt at, I guess you would call it price controls to bring the prices down. And then as they did this, then they divided up the different types of spectacles by their size. And so we get ranges from around 50,000 sesterces for a show, which is kind of small, up
Hmm.
to 200,000 and more for a show, which is, again, maybe a little bit more money. And then
Hmm.
inside of that, they divide up ranks, the costs for a ranked gladiator um, inside of these shows. So if your show was this much money, this is how much the gladiators are costing. This much money, this is how much it'll cost. Probably
Hmm.
didn't work. It's a very unusual document. It's fascinating. It's a very unusual document, in fact, because it's not the law. You'd think if you're going to put up an inscription with this, you would have the law. We don't have the law. What we have, in fact, is a version that's a speech by a senator
Hmm.
reading different sections of the law. And that's what got put up in like in Spain, not in Rome
Right.
or
Yeah.
anything, in Spain, far away. It's a very unusual document, but inside of that, they give you all kinds of details about about financing, about how much it cost for different gladiators and that sort of thing. Yeah,
Hmm.
there's lots to talk about with that document.
It is fascinating thinking about how there's this great range in prices for gladiators. From your Tiro up to your
Mhm.
tested champion, and that even these things are keyed to how big the games themselves are. Just this a sense again of how complex the world of gladiators really was.
Right, right.
So let's say you're a provincial elite, you're some local notable, you're throwing a games of a relatively modest scale.
Mhm.
How do you go about advertising that gladiators are coming to town?
Probably, well, again, word of mouth would be a common one.
Hmm.
Since it's at a regularly occurring festival, I
Hmm.
think people would know the festival's coming and what's going to happen are gladiatorial combats would be part of this. Uh, we have some inscriptions. Most of the time, where an upper class person will talk about the fact that he put on gladiatorial games comes in a form of a kind of a commemorative inscription. But
Hmm.
sometimes they're they're in the future tense, and that these games will happen in the city of whatever on
Hmm.
such and such a date, and will feature X number of gladiators doing this, that, and the other thing. So sometimes we have that. It seems to be often word of mouth. You'd know about Petronius,
Hmm.
first century Roman author. who has a dinner conversation, and at part of the dinner conversation, you have a couple of characters talking about these upcoming games. So that kind of word of mouth um, uh, uh, way of advertising or spreading the word, I think, is common. At Pompeii, of course, another place where we see um, uh, different kinds of evidence. There are, if anyone's been to Pompeii, you'll have seen graffiti all over the walls, including sometimes advertisements for elections or advertisements for upcoming gladiatorial games and shows and that sort of thing. So lots of evidence from Pompeii. That's gone from every place else, of course, but temporary evidence from walls and wall paintings and inscriptions, that sort of thing, graffiti.
I remember the famous one about, there will be awnings, right? He's advertising that.
Because it's going to be hot. I'm going to pay for the awnings to keep the sun off of you. So maybe we'll go this time.
Right. Now, I'm asked sometimes on my channel whether there's anything like promotional merchandise for gladiators, things that, if not necessarily action figures, that commemorate their deeds in the arena.
Yeah, that's interesting again, too. And it's the kind of thing that survives by chance. There are, we know, fragments or broken pieces of glass, small glass vases. There's several of them from France that show in relief. It was obviously mold made, show in relief on the glass various gladiatorial combats. And one assumes that these are commemorative items that one could purchase to remember the show that you saw. So it's that sort of thing. Vases, for example, there are vases from Britain where that happened to survive that show probably specific events that happened in the arena, and they're there as a souvenir to commemorate the show that you saw. Yeah.
It's always a little astonishing to me to see these elaborate mosaics, say, there's some like in the Borghese Villa, I think, where you would see these, named gladiators, which is apparently commemorative of a certain match. And this very expensive, high-status thing in the middle of some elite guy's dining room that he wanted to commemorate either a show he gave or a show that he was involved in some way, one assumes. But everything from that down to these, probably cheap glass vials or, terracotta lamps.
Exactly.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And these mosaics survive from all over the empire. There's a lot of them from North Africa as well. But of course, Italy, from the East as well. So you're right. Probably maybe the person who put on the show, then this is one of the things he's most proud of, and has this expensive mosaic made with named gladiators in his dining room or part of his house or something. Very odd.
So, thinking about something that you've written upon, the rules of gladiatorial combat. We often assume, or at least Hollywood tells us, it's a free-for-all, blood flying in every direction and a melee. But there obviously are rules, and pretty detailed rules. How much do we know about them?
So it's not the kind of thing that we expect our literary sources to describe. Of course, they don't. Cicero tends not to talk about gladiatorial combat very much, other than to look down his nose at it. But with some of these mosaics, other relief depictions show two gladiators, and traditionally we focused on the two gladiators fighting. But there's always, not always, but quite often, there's a third person. There's obviously a referee who's there overseeing the combat or supervising the combat in some way. So there are rules. There's a referee to enforce, obviously, rules. Many of the mosaics seem to show one of the rules, which is that a gladiator can submit. And the way to submit is, in Latin, is called ad digitum. So you hold up the finger. Literally, you fight ad digitum, you fight to the finger. And there are lots of depictions of a gladiatorial combat where one gladiator has obviously been wounded and he's holding up a finger, and the referee, this guy, who we know is called a summa rudis, or chief stick. Sometimes there's a secunda rudis, so two referees for a fight. And he's stepping in and stopping the fight. The remarkable thing about it is that quite often the depiction shows a gladiator having been wounded, drops his shield, signals surrender to the referee, holds up his finger to the referee. The referee steps in and stops the fight. But sometimes the gladiator submitting has even turned his back on his opponent. That is, he's not worried about being stabbed in the back or being his opponent taking this as an opportunity to kill him by when he's submitting. So there's an expectation that if I submit, then the referee will step in and stop the fight, and that will be, send both gladiators to their corners and not come out until the referee decides. But it's actually not the referee who decides. He stops the fight, and then we have obviously depictions of a referee stopping the fight and then turning and looking kind of off mosaic or off stage, but probably referring to and giving the gesture over to the person who paid for the show. So if you're providing a show, these two guys have fought. One guy has submitted. He's got a wound. He's submitting. The referee stops the fight. He turns to you to say, is this okay? And that's where you might turn to the crowd and give them the choice. Another way to submit seems to be to, instead of raising your finger, is to drop to a knee. So you fall to the ground, or you maybe throw your shield away or drop your shield and put your knee on the ground. And that's a way to submit. There are, again, relief. There's a famous relief from a tomb outside of Pompeii, which shows a gladiator right in the center on his knee, holding up his hand to his opponent, is submitting to his opponent. So one of the rules then seems to be that a gladiator can submit. It's not necessarily the end of the fight because they might be forced back in together. One way to submit is to hold up a finger. Another way to submit might be to drop to a knee. So if you're a gladiator, one of the things you might want to do is to try and force your opponent onto the ground. And there are depictions of gladiatorial combat where a retiarius with a trident has hooked his trident onto the shield of a secutor and is trying to force him. It's clear he's pushing him down to the ground, and the referee is stepping in and is about to stop the fight. So if you can get your opponent onto the ground, that might be a sign that he then would submit, and you might, that might end the fight there. And we know that this is a rule, and we know it's a rule because the biographer Suetonius describes the Emperor Claudius and describes how cruel Claudius was, whether he was or not, but this is how cruel Claudius was, that he had gladiators killed, even those who fell accidentally. That is to say, there's probably a rule that if you fall accidentally, well, then the referee would normally let you back up, right? If you trip and you fall, that's not a submission. It's just like tripped over this arm in the sand or something, whatever it was. So the referee can step in, stop the fight, and let you back up, right? So that's one of the rules, it seems. They're hard to reconstruct, though. You need to pull evidence from a variety of places to put this together.
Oh, I'm sure. You wrote an article, I seem to recall, about a gladiator who blamed his death on a bad call from the ref.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And that was one of these calls. So the depiction, it's a beautiful tombstone. So obviously he had money. It depicts two gladiators. One gladiator's on the ground, holding his helmet's off. He's holding his hand up, submitting. He's dropped his shield. He's totally defenseless. And the other gladiator is standing over him with two swords in his hand, clearly victorious. There's a palm branch shown behind him. Clearly, he's victorious. Underneath the relief is then this long inscription, and the inscription describes two gladiators, Diodorus and Demetrius. And the dead guy, Diodorus, you would assume he was the defeated gladiator, but he can't be. You wouldn't put that on your tombstone. So it's obviously he's showing the champion up above. And in the text of the inscription, it blames the referee for his death. Clearly, I think what's happened is it's always was interpreted that he was a gladiator with two swords, like a Dimacharius, a rare type of gladiator. But I think that can't be. I think what's happened is his opponent fell to the ground. Diodorus picked up the other sword, stood victorious over him, didn't kill him, right? His opponent surrendered. He didn't kill him. He expected to have won the won the match. Maybe he pushed him down. Maybe he forced him to the ground. He thought that he had won the match. Clearly, then what happened is the referee stepped in, stopped the fight. He clearly gave the sword back to his opponent, Demetrius. And then at the end of the fight, Diodorus died deliberately. We don't know. So he dies out of this fight. But initially he thought he'd won. And then his tombstone then depicts the moment that he thought he'd won the fight. His family thought he'd won the fight. Everyone thought he'd won the fight. But the referee interpreted that rule about falling or tripping or being on the ground to be that it was an accidental fall, I think.
It's interesting, both what that reveals, of course, about combat, and that the point that it was commemorated, that that the fallen gladiators' comrades or family chose to give this long account, and thought it would be appreciated or sympathized with.
Yeah, I agree. There's the gladiatorial families probably trained together, as we saw as we studied the ludus. They trained together. Many of these guys may have known each other. It would have been potentially a really horrifying situation to fight someone whom you knew. Maybe it was a friend, a comrade. And another curious thing that I've kind of made an argument for is the existence of what I've kind of termed a code or a code of conduct that's drawn from kind of modern sports. You hear about people who, the code in hockey or the code in football, or they play the game the right way. It's this nebulous kind of idea of the code. But some gladiatorial tombstones make a boast about the fact that a certain gladiator died having hurt no one, or that he had saved many souls in the arena, which is an odd thing, very odd thing for a gladiator, I think, to boast about. I think what it suggests is this kind of idea that these are comrades. They're fighting not necessarily to kill one another, but they're fighting to win the combat, maybe without killing someone. So if you can do that without killing someone, so much the better. You might know these people, or you might not be. I think probably have a certain sympathy for their plight because it's your plight as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it makes sense. Like you said, they're training together, especially. Yeah. I think it's Martial has one of his epigrams, praise for Gladiator, who was didn't kill people. He was very, very good at what he did, but he was a merciful gladiator and was admired as such.
Yes, yeah, and he's exactly. He could win without killing, I think, is one of the lines that that Martial describes him as. Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. Commodus became enraged. Again, a story from Dio, from an elite source. But Commodus supposedly became enraged at gladiators when they were hesitant to kill their opponent. So obviously he meant for the gladiators to fight to the death. Probably an unusual show, but he's the emperor. And when gladiators hesitated to do that, he was upset. So that tells me that it's meant to show the cruelty of Commodus, but what it tells me is that gladiators were not prepared to kill their opponent necessarily, or they didn't want to kill their opponent.
Right. Yeah, again, very different from the Hollywood depiction. So thinking about parallels with modern sports, and more especially with pro wrestling, which might seem like kind of a strange comparison, but were matches that we know of ever fixed in the arena? Or were there accusations of such anyway?
Yeah, so a few things. There's not very much evidence direct for that kind of thing, but I've hunted one up. I'll read it to you in a second here.
Oh, sure.
Oftentimes, gladiatorial combat, I mentioned Commodus making gladiators fight to the death. Oftentimes it seems that fights to the death were the exception, not the norm. Again, inscriptions talk about how a certain priest of the imperial cult is putting on gladiatorial games. And part of the games that he's going to put on, he'll have two gladiatorial pairs who are fighting for their lives, it'll say, in addition to the normal gladiatorial pairs, which suggests, and when he says this, he says it that he's also got permission of the emperor, imperial indulgentia, in order to put on these kinds of shows, which suggests to me that the normal type of fighting is not to the death. But if you wanted to put on gladiatorial combat to the death, then you need to have permission from the emperor. And this is in part, I think, because the great cost involved more than anything. We know Augustus banned fights called sine missione, without release. He banned that, made that illegal. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just that you needed permission then to do it. Other evidence suggests that even you needed permission to have gladiators fight with sharp weapons, which is very, very odd kind of thing. But it suggests that what's important is more the sword play and the technique that's expected rather than the gladiators killing each other. So there is a piece of evidence that suggests, so gladiators would not necessarily kill each other. There is a piece of evidence that where St. Augustine describes crowds urging on gladiators, and if they get wind of the fact, they think that the gladiators are in cahoots or colluding, then they're very upset. This is just what it says this is Augustine talking to his congregation, so he gets a little frothy. In their furious zeal for spectacles, these men become like demons. This is the people in the audience. By their shouting, their clamores, they incite men to slaughter each other and hurl themselves into enraged fights, even men who have done them no harm. These men, the gladiators, do this as long as they wish to please the demented people. And if they notice that the fighters are in agreement, they hate them and they harass them as if they are colluding to fake the fight. And the crowd cries out that they should be beaten with clubs. They even compel the referee, the iudex, Augustine says, who is supposed to correct unfairness, to side with their unfair view. And on he goes. He gets very frothy at the mouth after that. But there's some suggestion that maybe that people could interpret gladiators not hurting each other as somehow colluding in this kind of fight, the exact same kind of thing that we hear about with modern wrestling. There are other evidence. There's other pieces of evidence for, which might suggest this kind of thing too.
Oh, well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten all about that passage, actually.
Yeah.
And the one I think about, I think it's Domitian. Someone near the imperial box in the Colosseum shouts that it's fixed, so the emperor's gladiators never lose. Domitian has the guy, thrown into wild dogs in the arena with a sign around his neck. So don't criticize the emperor, even if it is true. But,
that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So thinking about the experience of a fight, so there's the two men in the arena. There's one, maybe two referees who are watching and supervising the fight, and then there are thousands or even tens of thousands of spectators, and among them, of course, the man who's giving the games. So think about this experience. How much do we know about the shouts and the gestures of the spectators while men are fighting?
Yeah, that's where I've kind of inspired by the COVID experience. I've really got to thinking about the arena. We always talk about the audience, but really we only talk about them as spectators, because we don't think about them hearing anything, or what they hear, what they say, what you would hear in the arena. So there is evidence, of course, for the not as much as you maybe think, but there's evidence for the shouting, the impact of the shouting of the crowd in the arena. And I think most famously, again, it was Augustine, where he describes how a friend of his went to, he refused. He was a Christian. He refused to go to the arena. He was in Rome studying law, and all his colleagues, fellow students, were cajoling him. Come on, let's go to the game. Let's go to the games. Let's go to the games. And finally he said, peer pressure is pretty powerful. Okay, finally I'll go, but I'll cover my eyes and I won't watch anything. And you can't, I'll be with you, but I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to watch the spectacle. And then Augustine goes on to describe how he has his eyes shut. He's not watching. He's not paying attention. But the roar of the crowd at a certain moment in the fight, Augustine actually says, hammered him, like slammed into him, and entered his soul. Augustine talks about through his ears, and compelled him to open his eyes. And he opens his eyes and then drinks in the sight. It's very almost cannibalistic, the way Augustine describes it. Drinks it in, sees the sight, and becomes one with the crowd. So the crowd noise, then obviously it's a fluctuating kind of thing. So he's able to shut it out most of the time until some really exciting event draws a super loud roar from the crowd, and he can't stand it anymore. So I was inspired to think. I was thinking about this during COVID, when sport, hockey, baseball, football, soccer came back online or on television, but in empty stadia, it was very dissatisfying to watch a baseball game with no crowd noise. And so networks started pumping in crowd noise, made up crowd
Hmm.
noise in order to fill this. Obviously, we need to share this, this experience with other people, because otherwise it's not. And that's what that's what crowd noise does. So there's cheering, there's evidence for acclamations. Quite often these acclamations are rhythmical.
Hmm.
Um, which would suggest that if it's rhythmical, you would chant it. You might sway as you're chanting it, so kind of dancing in unison and harmony with other people. These are powerful psychological cues. A crowd noise is a powerful psychological cue that this is something important to a community. That this is something important that I need to be a part of. Um, and that's, I think, what Alypius, Augustine's friend, gets
Hmm.
caught up in this. He wants to be part of this community. And it's all through sound, not the spectacle initially at all. It's the sound of the arena. So crowd sounds, uh, uh, acclamations, chants of the crowd, often, again, I think rhythmical chants of the crowd. There's music down in the
Hmm.
arena music inspires, again, dancing, or swaying movement. And that's all an important part of being part of a community.
Hmm.
It's community forming to have these sorts of sounds where silence is not.
Right.
Mm.
Hmm. I went to the University of Michigan for grad
Mm.
school, and there's the big house, which has more than 110,000
Mm.
people that can cram into there, and it really is a physical experience,
Yeah, yeah,
visceral. The sheer volume of sound, pounding you from every side, and it's
yeah,
very
yeah,
exciting.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Or Seattle, don't they register
mhm.
on the Richter scale?
Oh, yeah, exactly right.
But you can see where
Mhm.
Augustine's come from, where the sound hammers him, is what he says.
Mhm.
It's a physical sort of thing that hit him.
And thinking about the arena music, I remember, I think it's
Mm.
the Lytton mosaic, where they
Yeah.
have like a lady in a beehive hairdo playing the organ, in the arena, and then there's the gladiators fighting beside it.
Yeah.
Do we know much besides that there were organs, about the instruments that were played, or the kind of music they would have heard?
Yeah, so there's lots of evidence for the organ, the hydraulis, the
Hmm.
organ. It's hard to imagine that it would be loud enough, but
Right.
obviously it was.
Mm.
That it could be loud enough. Also, the tubas, these long
Oh, right.
um, military implements. You see them on Trajan's column, and the cornu, the
Hmm.
circular, again, a military instrument. You see it on Trajan's column. Um, a tuba has been reconstructed in an archaeological discovery of a tuba in France, reconstructed and then played, and it's a
Hmm.
very discordant sort of sound. Um, it's hard to imagine. I mean, we can listen to it, we can know what it sounds like. If we can reconstruct it, we know what it would sound like. I think they're used in the military because they could be heard from so far away. They were so loud.
Hmm.
So we can say what it might sound like to us today. It's hard to say what it would sound like to a Roman at the time, though we have, again, some descriptions of what the effect of what this tuba sounds like. And it's sometimes some of the descriptions of the effect of the sound of the tuba from Roman literary sources is that it inspires terror,
Hmm.
because it's a military instrument. So that maybe changes how we ought to think about what the music sounds like in the arena. Maybe it was serious, um, and more, not terrifying, but almost terrifying,
Hmm.
sounding music, rather than the dun 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 dun,
Yeah,
that we
right.
have from hockey games and that sort of thing today.
Sure, right, yeah.
Hmm.
It's not the team song or anything. It's more,
Yes, yes, yeah.
I guess, kind of reminding people that this is, Mortal Kombat, that this is
Hmm.
serious stuff.
Well, it's certainly dangerous, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
certainly very dangerous.
Hmm. So thinking about the gestures of the crowd, and in particular, the infamous pollice verso, the thumb. So what's your take on the thumbs up, thumbs down debate?
Yeah, it's a big debate. It is a debate.
Hmm.
um, that I think we can back up a little bit where it comes from. I
Hmm.
think it's that moment where the referee stops the fight, turns to the Munararius, the editor, the person paying for the show, putting on the show. Um, your show. What do you think? Did they fight on, or are you willing to accept the surrender of this gladiator? Traditionally, we think that that's where the Munarius, the editor, would then turn the decision over to the people, right?
Hmm.
And he often, if we have some descriptions of what he calls them, domini, my lords, turning to the people to say that, and gives the decision to them. It's, I think, our assumption that the people are all kill him, kill him, kill him. Where I think, in fact, some of the evidence shows quite the opposite, that they want their champions to live. But that's probably where the thumbs up, thumbs down gesture comes from. I tend to fall on the side that it's not a thumb up necessarily, but more of a stabbing gesture. That this is you kill them this way, not the kind of Fonzie sort of thing, right?
Yes.
I think there's a long history of the gesture. It's in the 20th century. I think it came out of the First World War. But I think the thumb gesture.
Oh, right. Our current idea of.
Yeah, the current idea.
It's more like pointing towards the throat, say, or something. Or,
yes, yeah. So to kill them or stab them in the throat, something like that.
I got it.
Yeah. Where a closed fist might be, no sword, so a saber, perhaps.
Interesting.
But it's the people, right? As Juvenal says, right? The people with the turn of their thumb can kill a gladiator.
So we touched on this before briefly, but how often, roughly, do we think these matches ended in death of one of the combatants?
Less than I think we think, although it was dangerous.
Of course.
So it's very hard to come up with these numbers. Galen, who was the physician to a gladiatorial family in Pergamon, boasts that while he worked there, at least, nobody died. That could mean that nobody who was able to be saved died. But my take is that there's lots of blood, there's lots of death, there's lots of homicide going on, lots of killing going on in the arena. Part of these shows are linked up with wild beast hunts, and there's lots of animals being killed. You mentioned Trajan, right? 11,000 animals in this. It's mind-numbing. The number, you can do the math. It's almost 100 animals a day for months. It's an astronomical number. Proper gladiators, I think, are expensive professionals. To kill them, we talked about how you rented a gladiator. To kill them, the cost goes through the roof. There's a passage in the digest in Gaius's Institutes, who's a lawyer, seems to be sort of a first-year law textbook. You probably know about this thing, dating to the same time as Marcus Aurelius, so later 2nd century. And at one point, he's talking about contract law, not gladiators, nothing like that. He's talking about contract law and the difference between hiring and leasing something and purchasing something. And so there are similarities in the contract, right? I give you money, you give me a car or whatever it is. So there are similarities. And the example he uses to describe it is curious. He says, imagine that I lease a gladiator from you for 20 denarii a fight. But if that gladiator is killed or maimed, then the cost goes to 1,000 denarii. And those prices are in line with the prices, in fact, that Marcus Aurelius's legislation trying to reduce the cost. So it's roughly the same kind of thing. But it's 50 times more expensive if a gladiator is maimed or killed. It's you break them, you buy them, right? So if I lease my gladiator to you and you kill him or you have his arm damaged or something like that, you have to pay his full price. But if it's just a lease, it's a much more reasonable kind of price. So killing gladiators, that's why turning this gesture, turning it over to the crowd, I think you need imperial permission to do that kind of thing, perhaps. Again, because the emperors are worried about local fortunes of the local elite being, drained on this kind of, these kinds of shows. They don't want people bankrupting themselves, as we hear about people doing, putting on shows. So the number of people dying is, again, it's really hard to tell, but there are rules and there are financial impediments in the way of killing proper gladiators. But as we talked about at the beginning, in the gladiatorial family were also convicts. And so one of the things you'd have in a munus that you put on, you'd have wild animal hunts in the morning, we think, gladiators in the afternoon. And at noon, we think often there are executions. And so if you come to the arena to see bloodshed, Seneca describes this kind of thing. If you come there, you'll see it. But it's not necessarily proper gladiators. It's instead people who have been condemned to death, legally condemned to death, and thrown into the arena.
Right, whether it's, ad bestias, whatever else, these Naxi, they're going to die. They're not going to escape the arena, where a gladiator might, conceivably.
Yeah.
And I've seen, I think there was some count done through tombstones. I think it was North Africa or something, where there was an estimate that it was like a 1 in 5 chance of a match ending in death in the first century, and then something like 1 in 4 later on. This is just a guesstimate on best in one region, from what I understand.
But it's a lot lower than we tend to think. Yeah.
Now, do we have a sense that that the matches became bloodier with time, or less so with time? Was there any change globally from our sense, or?
One thing we would tend traditionally to assume that with the Christian empire, things became, but doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, many of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, many of his laws are pretty, he doesn't ban gladiatorial combat, and many of the laws are still pretty bloodthirsty.
So for the people who do manage to survive, so what kind of prizes could a victorious gladiator expect to receive?
So I think money is one. That law from Marcus Aurelius, it goes into all kinds of detail. And one of the details is he's talking about trying to lower the cost, and all these myriad ways he's trying to lower the cost. One of the things that is mentioned is that a free man who's a gladiator receives 25% prize money, and a slave receives 20%. So we're not exactly sure what monies this is. Is it his lease costs or his overall where this, but he's receiving money. They don't talk about that. So no gladiator on his tombstone says how much money he made in each fight. But the fact that he has a tombstone, his wife, his family, his comrades put up a tombstone, they paid to have it inscribed. They paid to have, sometimes in verse, they paid to have a nice relief carved on it, showing him in all his glory. That costs money. So that's one of the prizes. More ostentatiously or more publicly, the prize would be a palm branch. And we hear about a gladiator, when he's victorious, he can pick up a palm branch and run. Caligula does it in the arena, run around with a palm branch. A crown, sometimes, like an athlete, an olive crown, the same kind of prize like that. So there are monetary prizes, and then, which are more under the table, but then the public prizes, the kind of honorific prizes that they want to boast about having. And then if you could also receive the rudis, a wooden sword, which is a symbol of being freed from the arena. So you're released from your oath, and then I guess you can become a free agent and rejoin afterwards.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One wonders how much is worked out in advance of these gifts. Whether they're the Munerius is saying to the Lanista, all right, so I'll give you 2 guys, you give me 10 aurea, we'll figure this all out.
Right, and this person will then will be freed, and that great popularity for the person putting on the show to free this famous gladiator, end his days as a gladiator, and let him go free.
I'm merciful, you're rich, everyone's happy.
Yeah. And the crowd cheering, that's what they want, right? These acclamations, you can imagine in an amphitheater with 20,000 or more people all chanting your name and clapping, and again, these kind of rhythmical chants, I think. Pretty special moment in your life, I think.
Oh, yeah. I wondered when I was writing these questions up, so if these men are receiving money, whether slave or free, even the ones who lose and get money sometimes, who's managing this money? Do we have any ideas? Like in the school, is there a bank of some sort?
That's an excellent. That's the kind of thing we don't probably.
Of course,
it's tempting to imagine that the ludus helps you manage this money. Many of these guys, the gladiators, their tombstones are put up by a wife. They have a wife. They have a family. So their money's, I would assume, being managed in the same way everyone else's money is being managed. The financial side of it, the money side of it, is a fascinating kind of, because if I'm a Lanista and you're a priest of the imperial cult in Ephesus or some great city, and you're hiring my gladiators, but you're only paying the lease cost, which is much lower, if you kill them all, what recourse do I have? I have I can't
Hmm.
sue you.
Yeah,
That's not good.
right.
So probably a lot of these, and to begin with, you as an imperial cult priest are not going to come and talk to me as a Lanista.
Oh, no, of course.
So there's probably agents and
Hmm.
middlemen and probably bankers. So you would put on deposit with a banker a
Mm.
certain amount of money that would either be released back to you by the banker or claimed by me as the Lanista at the end of it all. And it could be that part of the reason for the collapse of the institution in the later times was the collapse in the banking system. Maybe
Hmm.
you just couldn't do this.
Hmm.
These transactions just couldn't happen as easily as they had before.
Yeah, well, hopefully some papyrus from Egypt will come to light. They'll shed more, make this all
Yeah,
clear to us. But
yeah,
it's
yeah,
fascinating, right?
yeah.
The negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
So back to the gladiators and their actual fights in the arena. You mentioned before that there's a ranking system among gladiators. How did this work, as far as we know?
So, as far as we know, so
Right. Mm-hmm.
the that law again presumes that you're going to pay more money for a better gladiator. So there has to be a recognizable system in place that would that you would be able to tell that this is a better gladiator than this one. This one's more expensive. This one has more experience, and so therefore is worth more money. It could be that you know the gladiators, but at some point that becomes unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
Inscriptions, and not every gladiatorial tombstone, but inscriptions, especially from the Greek world, but there's some in the Roman West as well. Most of them that mention this kind of a ranking system will mention something called a primus pallus, literally a first post. It's kind of a funny thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the palace is a post, and we know that Roman soldiers, but also gladiators would in the ludus would train against. So their sword work, they train against a post as you
Mm-hmm.
practice striking and hitting with defending with your shield and hitting, stabbing at a post. You're not going to hurt anyone that way, and you can practice your swordsmanship. So a post, but there's also references to a second palace and a third palace, which sounds like I mean, if I were, I would like to be part of the first palace, not the second
Right.
palace
Yeah.
or the third. It's
Mm-hmm.
a hierarchical society. So that looks like it might be a reference to a ranking system. There's, I think, even one reference to a fourth palace.
Mm-hmm.
So that, to me, my suspicion is that that's a reference to this ranking system. Where we do have references to it, most of them are to the Primus Palace.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you're not going to say you're from the fourth palace
Yeah.
you're
Right.
just not going to say that on your tombstone. But there are a few references to that. It could also be organizational, but to
Mm-hmm.
me, we need a ranking system that's recognizable. And that's the only ranking system that really kind of exists
Hmm.
or
And
suggests that it's a ranking system. Mm-hmm.
oh, right. And so based, we assume on record and experience.
Record
Mm-hmm.
experience. Yeah. So a tiro, as you mentioned, but first a recruit.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's the Roman military term for a recruit, but he starts at the bottom and then you work your way up. I think within a specific armament type, we talked about at the beginning, the doctores, the
Mm-hmm.
instructors are specific to type, and the tiro is specific to type, and you rise up through the ranks, fighting with and training with the gladiators of the same type. So all the murmelos train together, all the secretores train together, that sort of thing, and then rising through the ranks that way.
Hmm. Do we know the names of the superstars, the most famous gladiators of a given era?
Yeah, they appear sometimes in literary references. Yeah, so think again like Petronius in the first century, in Nero's court describing Petrides, these famous gladiators.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes in that's where they show up in literary references. Juvenal will talk about a famous gladiator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. How much evidence do we have for female gladiators appearing
Oh,
in the arena?
that's a. So there is evidence for them, not nearly as much as for regular male gladiators, but there are relief panels. There's a famous one from Halicarnassus
Mm-hmm.
now in the British Museum, showing Amazon and Achillea, these two female
Mm-hmm.
gladiators, clearly fighting. The same rules seem to apply to them. They're referred to in Greek as having been released from their fight. sort of the same rules applying. There are literary descriptions. Domitian, for example, we know put on female gladiators. There's epigraphic evidence for it. There's an inscription from Ostia talking about a priest or a magistrate putting on gladiators. He says he's the first to put on female gladiators. So there is evidence for it. They're not nearly as, that's not even a word for a female gladiator. They're not nearly as ubiquitous as Roman male gladiators.
Of course.
But they do exist. Which is curious. I think it's a fascinating sort of side to it. People make huge arguments about gladiators and Roman male military virtue and that sort of thing, and then to have and again, they're common enough that and everywhere in the empire that maybe people would have seen this. So so they do exist.
Right.
A curious thing. Some of the great evidence for what goes on in the arena is from Christian martyr acts. And one of them is the martyr Perpetua from North Africa, who has a series of dreams. You know about her, has a series of dreams as she's waiting execution. And one of the dreams is that she appears in the arena to fight a sort of a gladiator. It's all mixed up. It's kind of a pseudo gladiatorial combat mixed up with maybe pancration and boxing and this sort of thing. But in the dream, in order for her to fight, she turns into a man. So in her dream, she's a man before she can fight in the arena. So it's common for women to fight in the arena, or it happens that women fight in the arena, maybe not all that common that she could stay as a woman and continue to fight.
It is fascinating. Like you said, it's so bound up, or it seems to be so bound up, and the idea of the warrior in this very masculine sense. And so maybe the thrill was this subversion of gender roles, in the space of the arena.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before that a gladiator who had fought well could be awarded the rudis, this wooden sword that symbolized his release from his contract. Do we know how else gladiators could be, liberated from their contracts, maybe end their careers? And maybe it's how often this happened. Again,
love to know that.
Of course, right?
Have your actual statistics on this sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
They're not dying as. They're not being killed in the arena as often as we traditionally wanted to think they were, I think, although it's still dangerous, right? These weapons, if you get a cut that's infected, you could die later on, that sort of thing. There are depictions of gladiators being executed, but there's lots of references to them, again, receiving the rudis. I suspect that a slave gladiator could build up his winnings if he's successful over and over again. And purchase his own freedom, as we know slaves could do as well. To receive the rudis, I think, was a kind of a mark of a great gladiator who had kind of reached kind of the apex of his career, maybe a little bit beyond it. My suspicion is that these guys could either return to the arena as kind of free agents, or my suspicion is that they could then become referees in the arena, right? They're called a summa rudis, a secunda rudis. There's a hierarchy already set up there. So a retired gladiator who's a rudarius, a rudis man, maybe enters back into the ludus or into the service as an owner, as a trainer, perhaps. He's a specialist. He survived, but he could also then become a referee in the arena, secunda rudis, and then maybe a summa rudis at the top, who had, we know, some considerable social standing in communities.
So often, even if they're released from their contract, they're remaining in the community of the arena. They're part of this world still, which makes sense, right? Because there's such low status everywhere outside the arena, but within it.
And sometimes with considerable money that they'd won.
Right.
There's a reference to, I think it's in the digest, to a community in the Greek world who had sent an ambassador to the emperor, and the emperor dismissed this embassy because he found out that one of the ambassadors sent to him had been a former gladiator. So
really?
On the one hand, it says, well, the emperor this person has infamia, he's disgraced, we don't want him anything to do. On the other hand, it says that community thought, hey, here's the most important guy in town that we can send to the emperor himself on an embassy. And so, so it tells, the same piece of evidence tells two different stories.
Right. So, thinking globally as we wrap up here, you mentioned before that there's a remarkable degree of standardization across regions in terms of combat. Um, do we think that the games seem to have the same trajectory throughout the empire? That you mentioned before, the collapse of the banking system in the third century seems to really deal a serious blow to the games. A sense of how the games evolve across the imperial era from, say, the Age of Augustus into late antiquity. What's changing? They're becoming less spectacular because there's less money around. They're becoming bloodier, different kinds of spectacles.
Yeah, I think we always have to remember too that it's not just gladiators, right? But
Of
there are the
course.
beast fights that tends to be kind of a tripartite show with beast fights and executions and gladiators as well. And what tends to die out in the later period, sort of well into the Christian period, is the gladiatorial side of things. And it's not necessarily because it was seen, I think, as extra cruel, although some Christian sources say that. I think it's partly the financing and the cost of the whole thing. But the other parts of the Muna survive, right? There's still executions going on. And there are still wild beast hunts, wild beast fights that are a key part of this as well. So it's a gradual disappearance well into the fourth century. Augustine's his friend there around the year 400 or so in Rome, and there's still a huge cheering crowd in the Colosseum, right? 50,000 people cheering a gladiatorial show.
There's that. I think it's a myth of I think it's Saint Telemachus in Rome, who leaps into the arena, to stop combat, and then is stoned for his troubles by the crowd.
Yes.
But I think you're right about it being financial, basically, because even the beast hunts, which do continue, become more and more anemic. That they have a couple bears from Germany and not much else.
They may have hunted them all out, though, right?
Right.
They may have driven animals to extinction, as I think they did in North Africa.
Right.
The lions and with complete praise of the people.
Of course,
this is a good thing. Nature is the enemy very different from our point of view, but nature is the enemy. And if the Roman emperor can kill all the lions, that's great.
Right. And no environmentalists in that era. So to kind of close out with the fascination of the gladiators, so on the one hand, they are reviled. The guy sent as an ambassador is rejected out of hand because he was a former gladiator. But on the other side, they are revered, adulated. Within their little sphere, at least, they're a big deal. And the emperors themselves seemed, some of them anyway, think it worthwhile to emulate gladiators. Commodus most famously becoming a gladiator, in effect. But other emperors sponsoring the games, appearing in the Colosseum. So have you any thoughts on this dynamic of how these men are simultaneously, thought of the lowliest of the low, murderers and butchers, and yet is somehow embodying something that the Romans admire? Just your thoughts on this dynamic.
It's a curious thing, and it is commented. Tertullian, a Christian source, of course, comments on that exact point. That on the one hand, they're despised, officially, legally, formally despised, but on the other hand, they're adored by the people. It's a curious kind of thing. Traditionally, people have thought that it represents, apart from the person who's doing it, but it represents the ultimate in sort of Roman traditional values of military virtue, military discipline, extreme martial skill. So these kind of core Roman values, and then this is a pure celebration of it. That might explain why it became so popular at the funerals in the Republic in the early days, right? This is a way to celebrate. This is what we're all about, these kind of martial values. And then in the imperial period, it spreads, especially outside of Italy, all over the empire, in connection with the imperial cult. It's very clearly a very obviously Roman thing to do. But when you see these advertisements for the spectacles, they'll put the reason they state they're putting on, I'm paying for these shows, and the reason they state they're putting it on is in commemoration of the emperor and the Senate and the people of Rome and the Roman army and the local community and the local people. So they're kind of in the list of belonging. This is why I'm putting on this show, this obviously Roman show. This is in the Greek world, so in the list someplace, might be at the bottom of the list, but you belong, right? You're part of
Mm.
the empire because you buy into this clearly Roman and
Hmm.
Romanizing spectacle that's being celebrated at great expense for your entertainment.
Huh. Well, it's fascinating. And like you said, so much more than just bloodshed. This is a ritual, a spectacle, a celebration, but not just, two guys hacking away at each other. Or
Yeah.
not just that, anyway.
Yeah, a little bit of
Right.
that.
It is that for sure.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Professor Carter, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, it's been my great pleasure.
Yeah,
And to everyone
great.
listening, thanks for tuning in, and much more soon.
Excellent.